You're listening to The Virtuous Mind, a podcast from Providence Christian College that discusses all facets of the human experience and the liberal arts from a biblical worldview. I'm your host, Dr. David E. Alexander. Is work simply a necessary evil? What role does work play in our flourishing? Has the church failed to articulate a biblical theology and philosophy of work? Get ready to be surprised, challenged, and I hope encouraged by my conversation with David Bahnsen. Bahnsen is the managing partner and chief investment officer of the Bahnsen Group, a wealth management firm that oversees $4 billion in clients' assets. Bahnsen has been named as one of Forbes' top 250 advisors and is a regular contributor to National Review, where he writes on the intersection of markets and politics. David Bahnsen is also the author of numerous books. The newest one is Full Time: Work and the Meaning of Life, which biblically examines the importance of work in the Christian life. Strap in, folks, for what I promise will be a ride well worth taking. David, thank you so much for joining us on the Virtuous Mind podcast. I'm super excited to have you on, and you've got a new book out, Full Time: Work and the Meaning of Life. Maybe if you could just give a broad orientation to the book, the impetus perhaps behind writing this book, why this book now, the audience perhaps that you have for this book, some of that big geography, and then maybe we can dive into some of the smaller locations in the book.
Well, I appreciate the kind words and the tee up. And let me just give the background here. Essentially, this topic is something I've been passionate about for my whole adult working life. And I talk about this in the introduction to the book, that I'm very transparent about the fact that much of my passion for this subject is somewhat biographical. Now, I'm now an old man. I'm 50 years old. I turned 50 a few months after the book came out. So I wrote the book in the youth of my late 40s, but now I deliver this message in the wisdom of my young 50s. And, my father passed away when I was 20 years old, and I began working in terms of a young adult life. I had had jobs all through my teenage years, and I even talk about that through each chapter of the book, laying out different jobs I had over the years as kind of a fun anecdote. But I began working by necessity. My mom was already gone. My dad had passed. There was not financial support. And I found that the issue of work was not merely the economic necessity, which is a very big deal for most people, but the existential reality of going through a traumatic event, of losing your best friend, your hero, your father, and having work as a means of channeling the way you cope with some of these things, but also finding purpose and direction in one's life. So that was 30 years ago. And I have absolutely no ability to even comprehend my life without work as one of the things God used therapeutically through those challenges. I don't recommend that people all embrace a young adult passion for work in through those circumstances. I would prefer to have not had to go through that, but that's what God had for me. And out of that journey, I got a chance to develop my passion for work, but also discover that in the Reformed Christian circles that I had belonged to my whole life, that I didn't often find a lot who agreed. In practice, sometimes not in theory either, but even sometimes where they agreed in theory, not in practice, with a strong careerism, commitment to vocational theology, And in a lot of ways, I found the reform world to sometimes be practicing a similar escapism or transactional view of work that you could find in other non-reformed evangelicals. And so that really lit a fire under me. But that still doesn't answer your question. I'm sorry for the long answer, but this is the heavy one. All my other answers are going to be much more succinct, but this one, you've fired me up already. The impetus was the COVID moment, because it is one thing for me to kind of begrudge or bemoan the fact that a lot who share some of my theological distinctives did not have the same passion for work I did. It's another thing for me to believe that a lot of the broad evangelical church was still caught in a sort of escapism and retreatism and pietism about work. But America's DNA as just a nation state was clearly founded on a Puritan work ethic, high regard for the dignity of work. And to see in the COVID moment this big increase in isolation, in desolation, in tribalism, and in loneliness, and see people say, well, yeah, it's because people work too much. When I believe from the bottom of my heart that the remedy, that the antidote to those problems is a greater purpose found in work. The work is not the cause of our problems, it's a solution to many of these problems. And the very fact that through public policy, they codified this term non-essential work, I found so repugnant and offensive, tying all of these circles in, evangelical, reformed, and just the broader, let's say, outside the church aspects of American society. It became something I felt I needed to write sooner than later.
The book is powerful in a lot of ways, knowing sort of what it's coming out of and some of the more immediate causes for it, I think is quite helpful. Perhaps the most disruptive target that you have is the church. You point out, right, that the church spends a lot of time chastising its members for maybe having a tendency to idolize work. And you reply with the opposite problem is actually far more prevalent, that people are not working enough, not that people are working too much. In your mind, your estimation is that a lot of the problems that we're seeing in our culture today with respect to depression, anxiety, addiction, suicide, loneliness, decline of the family, decline of friendship, all of those things you also tie to a decline in the value that people place on work.
Yeah, I use this analogy that has been available in other aspects of Christian teaching over the years too, that all of us are afraid of tidal waves if we live in a place that's susceptible to tidal waves, but that doesn't mean a pastor in Kansas needs to be giving a sermon about the dangers of tidal waves. In other words, context is important. And there are certain components that are more timely. You know, Jesus himself spoke of the weightier matters of the law. I agree that nobody should be ignoring their family because of work. And I agree that there is a sense in which an ordered Christian life has components of all elements of our kingdom responsibilities. What I do not agree with is that we have a systemic problem in our churches of people working too hard. Mm-hmm. I believe that that is equivalent to a tidal wave in Kansas. That when you are dealing with a society that is dealing with the chronic delayed adulthood, extended adolescence of young men, many times pre-married, sometimes even after they're married, that we are not really being serious or honest if we believe our pews are filled with people that are just trying too hard to strive and aspire and compete and excel and flourish in their careers. I haven't seen it. I believe that by and large, in the cultural context of the day, pastors seeking to actually deliver in context to the needs of their congregation are dealing with a lot of young men that are playing video games in their mom's basement. And a lot of people who are married and out of mom's basement, but who have a very accepted mediocrity about their vocational life. Now, if I thought that I didn't have a good representative sample, and this was just anecdotal information, and that by and large other pastors are dealing with other things, then I would have to be humbled and say maybe I shouldn't be painting with too broad a brush. But I do not think that. I think I do have a representative sample, and I think it's rather overwhelming. So that's the idea there, that pastors obviously ought to preach the whole counsel of God, and there is an important message about what it means to be a good father, what it means to be a good husband, what, all the different roles we may wear, that we may have, the hats we may wear, etc. But here's the thing. I just think it's very easy to give sermon after sermon after sermon on the thing that nobody disagrees with. Hey, you need to be a really good father. Pastor, I'm not sure I agree with that one.
Yeah.
Who's pushing back on it? Now, not everyone's living it. Not everyone's doing it. I struggle at times. I make mistakes as a dad, as a husband. I try my best, but no. I understand people fall short, but nobody finds the message problematic in and of itself. But a message about excelling at work, about aspiring, about the kingdom of God, involving our creative purpose in domains of technology, agriculture, finance, entrepreneurialism, all of these different elements that matter. This ruffles feathers. The other messages don't.
You've got a number of quotes in the book from Dorothy Sayers, and one of the first ones that you have is related to this, right? Where she mentions that lots of pastors, lots of sermons may encourage the carpenter, right, to show up to church, to not drink so much, to take care of their family. And she says the primary message to the carpenter should be to make good tables.
Yeah.
What I found fascinating in your book as I was reading it is that, in a sense, you are almost suggesting that the Protestant position today in our churches and in the Reformed churches is somewhat like the Roman Catholic position with respect to our vocation, right? That the clergy are the ones that have the vocation, that have the real calling, the essential calling or something like that. And every other one of us, right, has something. We're almost all non-essential workers. I'd love for you to talk about the relationship between glorifying God and work and our human nature.
Well, it is the kind of underlying point of the book that theologically, I believe this message transcends the sort of character traits we're used to appealing to out of the nobility of work. Now, I believe those character traits matter. And I think when we say that hard work makes us responsible, or hard work shows diligence or responsibility, faithfulness to certain commitments we have, that there's a benefit to, there's virtues that are cultivated in showing up on time, and all of these different components that most of us have probably experienced, hopefully cultivated in our own lives, and certainly observed. I agree with all of them, but I believe that the biblical message starts with our created purpose. It starts with something that is ontological to the being of mankind, that because believers have, in the richest part of the Christian tradition, the belief that we are made imago Dei, that we are made in the image and likeness of God, it requires us to ask the question of what that means. And the answer is found in Genesis chapter 1, where we are told 4 times in 2 verses that we are made in the image and likeness of God, that the meaning of it obviously is not found in us sharing the attributes of God's omniscience, omnipotence, or omnipresence. Those remain things that even those of us who bear his image do not and cannot share with him. But what we do have is a mandate to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, to rule over the earth, to go be productive and cultivate the earth, to care for the garden, and so forth and so on. All of these things throughout Genesis 1, Genesis 2, prior to the fall, prior to sin entering the world, we were given the mandate to go work, to essentially co-create with God, that he made the world ex nihilo, and we cannot do that. We cannot create out of nothing. But what we can do is create out of the materials of the world that God gave us. And in fact, must do, because he made us to do it, and defined our image-bearing status in that very context in verses 26 through 28 of Genesis chapter 1. Now, the fact of the matter is that mankind has been doing this ever since the garden. We have been creating the goods and services that enhance quality of life, that serve one another, that meet our own needs, first allowing us to survive, and secondly, allowing us to thrive, to build civilization. This is a creation mandate that has been present since the foundation of the world. And the reason for it is that it is what God made us for. So I had a few people, obviously of a similar theological background as you and I, that would say, well, David, your subtitle of your book is Work and the Meaning of Life, but what do you say about the first Westminster Shorter Catechism question, that what is the chief end of man? Man's chief end is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. How do you reconcile this contradiction? And I say, I'm sorry, but I think that's what I just said. When I say work is the meaning of life, I am saying, I'm providing an active illustration of what it means to glorify God and enjoy him forever. We glorify him in our creative, productive, and innovative endeavors, and we most certainly enjoy those elements and in fact derive great meaning in our lives from such.
Well, and I mean, there you can see a relationship, right, between glorifying God in our work and enjoying, right, the fruits of our labor, enjoying not even just the fruits of our labor, right, enjoying the labor itself.
Yeah.
That's one of the themes that I think you highlight really nicely in the book also, right, is that not seeing work simply as a means to some other end, but the work itself is fulfilling. Connecting that to the enjoyment part of the answer to the shorter catechism question number 1, and then connecting that to the current crisis that we have, right? The loneliness epidemic, the substance abuse, rise in substance abuse, rise in suicide, rise in depression, anxiety, reliance on antidepressants, decline in family, decline in friendship. Would you talk a little bit more about that? I think your prescription for dealing with all of those problems, I must confess, when I first started reading that chapter, I maybe had a slight eye roll, and I thought, come on, work as the solution, or amongst the solutions to this issue. It's a little far-fetched. Convince me.
Listen, there is a correlation that does not require us to believe it's causative, but there is no doubt a correlation between those that are at home all day and those who develop drug and alcohol problems, who develop depression, who develop physical atrophy. There's a lot of antisocial behavior that comes from inactivity. Now, there's unhealthy activities in the world too, but I've never encountered one more unhealthy than the activity of inactivity. Now, when I read biblical stories of the giants, of the true disciples of the faith, those who are there to provide us an example of what it means to be a servant, of what it means to be faithful. These are people who sound to me like they would be called type A in our current society, that they'd be called workaholic. They would have all these pejorative, psychologizing terms put on them, all simply describing the fact that when they woke up, they did a bunch of things. And to the extent that one believes, no, there is great merit in not doing things, I don't think that's a person who has a lot of case studies. Now, I understand that we all might have certain different wiring personalities. There's intensity. I also believe, and I have a whole entire section of the book about this, in not just the biblical allowance of, but a mandate for rest. My problem with our modern understanding of rest is it's very selective. We say that on one hand, we don't need a day set aside to fully rest and recharge our batteries in the very model that God himself modeled through creation. 6 days shalt thou work, and the seventh will be a day of rest. That we instead say our rest ought to be employers have to give their employee, they treat them like children, that they need yoga time in the middle of the afternoon. And we have all of these sort of Department of Labor regulations about how what restrictions ought to be put on work from a regulatory context. Well, the 6 days shalt thou work and the seventh shall be a day of rest has two commandments in it. It's a compound commandment. It is to take a day of rest, which many people don't do to their own peril. And it is a commandment to work 6 days. And I think that so many Sabbatarian Christians have selectively picked only the second half of the fourth commandment. That, we really need more Christians taking the day of rest. And I say, I agree. Now, there's a corollary to that commandment to work the other 6 days. And I think, too, the chicken or egg here is important, that the reason we rest is to recharge our batteries for our creative purpose of work. We do not work for the purpose of rest. And this is where secular society has really done something quite perverse, made possible by the prosperity of our age and just modern amenities and technology, where, one doesn't have to be on the farm at 5 a.m. in order for one to have their daily bread. But this idea that you work for the weekend, and you brought up my talk on retirement, even aside from a week by week by week paradigm that says work in the middle of the week, but then you're doing it so you can just get to the weekend and go party or go lay on the couch or whatever it is. But also in a macro context of the life expectancy one may have, people envision their life being, I got to go clock in, clock out, and accumulate some money and do the deal I got to do in my 30s, 40s, and, probably into my 50s. But then I'm doing it so then I can clock out, not for Sunday, not for the weekend, but for my 60s, 70s, have this 25-year vacation. And that imagery is undeniable, that Madison Avenue is marketed a 25-year vacation as the purpose of our work. Work now so you can be unrestricted by economic necessity. And then with that, give yourself the ability to go on a sailboat all the time or golf 5 days a week or whatever it is. And I believe very much in financial freedom, and I believe in greater flexibility and optionality, and greater comforts and conveniences in life. I really do. But I will say this, the notion that the purpose of work is to not do it anymore is perverse, and it had no limiting principle. It did not merely lead to baby boomers circling their 65th birthday on their calendar. It led to millennials that now go into job interviews asking if they can start in 3 months so they can go backpacking in Argentina before they begin their job and career and whatnot. The whole thing has gotten out of control, but it all starts with that mentality.
Given, and I think you make a very powerful case for this in your book, really just exegeting the scriptures quite nicely and powerfully, that our meaning, right? We're created to work. And so you can then see people who hate work, or people who disdain work, people who see work as a necessary evil. Think about how to translate that, right? So if work is the meaning of life, if work is how we glorify God and enjoy him forever, then to hate it is to hate our purpose, right? It's to hate the reason for which we were made. To see it as a necessary evil is to think that our purpose is somehow a kind of necessary evil. I mean, there's some deep incoherence here. Given the truth of your thesis, the contemporary attitude towards work really is yet another way of rejecting God, right? It is another way of telling God, you do not get to say what my purpose is, I do. And I reject it. I reject the purpose that you have imposed upon me. That's powerful.
Well, it is, and it also does speak to a much broader theological point that many of us in the Reformed tradition hold on to. What is the original sin? What was the mistake of Adam and Eve in the garden? What is the first commandment? I mean, even when you get into the specifics of certain sins around lying and adultery and whatnot, doesn't all sin come down to mankind trying to play God?
Yeah.
So when we have said, I have a different plan for my life or for my created being than the plan you set for us, which is, by the way, universal. And that's a very important thing too in Christian theology, that which has economic implications, because I think essentially what the church has done and what our modern society has done and what that COVID moment I alluded to earlier is basically say, all of you with second tier jobs, it's not essential. And we understand you hate your work and we don't blame you. But if you write for the Atlantic, or if you're a corner office lawyer on 6th Avenue here in New York City, well, that's pretty important. It's created a snobbery of nobility in the way we view vocation that has no place in Christian theology. And I wrestled with this in writing the book because it was apparent to me, and it was something I wanted to preempt, that I am a corner office Wall Street guy who has done very well for myself, and that many people could intuitively say, David, this book may or may not be onto something, but I don't want to hear it from you. You go clean some toilets for a few years and then we'll talk. And I think that's a reasonably fair thing to say, except for the part that I did start with significant grunt jobs and difficult work and did not start in a moment of great, white collar socioeconomic prestige. My love of work has truly come through all sorts of jobs of varying degrees of economic advantage and disadvantage and also just pleasantries. And that really the point I'm trying to make about the value God puts on the work done by the worker extended towards someone who benefits from the work, that these things are vital to God's created purpose for everybody. And that the Imago Dei theology that we talk about is not this 50-50 moment of half of the people in our society are producers and half are consumers. That's sort of the underlying creed of modern economics, that we need the productive people out there. They're pretty special. They're pretty smart. They're inventing Google and coming up with apps on the iPhone. But, then there's all the regular people. That stuff doesn't apply to them. They need to just kind of have other people create things for them so they can live a life of consumption. And we'll get economic growth if they, buy more cheeseburgers and take more vacations. My problem with that is it is anthropologically distorted. It has a flawed view of the human person.
Yeah.
The human person was created for work, for productivity, for creativity. Once I say some of you were created to work and some of you were created to be beneficiaries of the work done by the others, I've created a caste system.
Yeah.
And that is economic flaw that is rooted in a theological flaw. When we talk about our witness in the kingdom and the presence that we can have as far as what it is we believe. Look, there are people on the platform that can share verbally and intellectually gospel truths. But the vast majority of us will never get a better opportunity to demonstrate kingdom living than in our work.
Mm.
And this is repeated in the Bible, that those who do their work well, that they'll be noticed by kings, by noble rulers, there'll be people of influence that see and appreciate it. There's leverage in that. And that leverage is not merely transactional, like you get a bigger bonus, so now you'll have more money to give to the church fund. It's saying that you will actually have greater witness, that you will have the respect of your peers because you've earned it, and have more influence, persuasion, and so forth. If every believer believed this and lived it in the marketplace, we would Christianize this society. Within broad evangelicalism, I believe it is a byproduct of a 20th century theological error that has largely been undone in some other domains, but not this one. That effectively work was not, and the marketplace, commerce, just these vocational spheres that you and I are spending our time talking about today, they were not unique, that there was a sort of retreat from the public square in the early 20th century that was manifested in politics, in media, in education, and yes, the marketplace. And that we spent a lot of the end of the 20th century kind of changing our mind about retreatism from the public square in politics and education. You know, obviously people are familiar with the quote unquote moral majority, the Christian right, the kind of desire after Roe v. Wade and other high profile issues that did not seem to be going the way many believers wanted, to re-engage in the political front, to have their values and needs addressed in the political sphere. And likewise with education, I think decades of a very explicit secular humanism in higher education and in K through 12 led to a lot of believers saying, okay, this is not working. This is not how we want to raise our kids, grandkids. And a homeschool movement developed, and a Christian school movement developed, and one that almost didn't exist in the 1970s, 40 years later, has tens of millions of people, associated. So I see these as positive things. Myself being a Kuyperian who believes in this lordship of Christ applied to all areas. But then I have to ask myself, why did this not take place within the marketplace? And I think what happened is a faith and work movement was kind of born about 25 years ago that was really born out of successes that a lot of evangelicals were having in their jobs. They were finding themselves in more upwardly mobile, largely white collar positions, middle management, sometimes a little bit more executive than that, and saying, okay, we need Bible studies or discipleship groups for some of these folks. They'd put networking, events together. Guys could get together and do small groups and pray together, and a lot of other things that I'm fully supportive of, but never even remotely addressing the underlying intrinsic inherent value of the work. It was more hey, you're kind of doing well in your job. Here's another guy's doing well in their job. And let's put some forms of Christian communion, fellowship, and accountability together, support systems. But the idea of rooting it to the notion that this very work is a tremendous element of kingdom priority, I think is very uncomfortable for a lot of people. And then the fact that our jobs are the source of wealth building, I think Christians have always been incredibly uncomfortable with the theology of wealth. And it's very hard. I say in my book that I think Every Good Endeavor by Tim Keller was my favorite book I had read on work that at least had been written in the last, 20, 30 years. And yet it doesn't talk about money at all. It talks about creativity and beauty and a lot of these anthropological benefits of work. It really has a strong creational normative foundation to it. And I love that about the book. but it kind of shies away a little bit from the ambition of work. So Christians are sometimes inherently uncomfortable with wealth. And I think that those economic and material needs have to be addressed. And then this kind of gets down to one of the pre-existing passions of my life, even apart from the subject of this book, which is just Christians' general unfamiliarity with and uncomfortable relationship to economics. My fundamental issue around the baby boomers' attitude towards this subject is the impact it had on millennials. That I do even though I didn't necessarily phrase it this way in the book, in the 150 plus talks and interviews I've done on the book's message since the book came out, I've done a lot around the generational theory whereby from the boomers to Gen Xers like myself to the millennial Gen Y, and then now that younger adult generation of Gen Z, that there are very different issues at play here. For one thing, the baby boomers worked very hard. They produced a ton of goods and services. It was a very successful generation in terms of productive output. But they were the very first that had the idea of retirement on the radar when they entered the workforce. It had never been possible in human history before because the mortality was such and the general prosperity such that people generally worked until they died, and that was their retirement, was they were no more. And then the life expectancy post World War II going up 10 years between the time baby boomers were born and the time they entered the workforce, and then going up almost another 10 years between the time that they entered the workforce and the time they were of retirement age. It gave people the opportunity to even think about such a thing. And of course, we had such an extraordinary expansion of American prosperity in the 70 years that followed World War II that these things became more materially possible. And IRA accounts, pension funds, 401ks, these conventions, products and services that kind of help crystallize it. So look, I am not critical of the idea of retirement being a term we use to describe not needing to work anymore. In other words, one having financial resources that could sustain them if they did not have a paycheck. That's not what my critique is about. I very candidly work harder right now at age 50 than I think I ever have. And I am more financially independent than I've ever been. Those two things have never been connected to me, and I don't want them to be connected for others either. Because what it does is inevitably lead to the belief, a transactional belief, that the purpose of the work was to get to a point where I could clock out. Now, some may have a boss they don't like. And once they have a certain financial independence, they have more options that might enable them to still be productive and creative, but not connected to a boss. And so they get more freedom. I'm not critiquing that. I do critique, though, in the book, the idea that, oh, no, I'm still staying busy in retirement because I'm on my board of a nonprofit. I hear that one a lot. And I'm on several boards, and I'm all for people, especially folks who have something to contribute to a mission, an organization they believe in, to bring their talents into those board meetings. That is not the entirety of what I'm speaking to. An hour or two every quarter, sitting around a conference table, chatting about an organization. And I also am not talking about going to do things that you're not really very good at. So I use the example of someone who says, well, now I'm retired, I'm going to go to Mexico and build orphanages. And I say, well, maybe you're really good at that, but I don't know, you were a lawyer your whole career. Do you think that your best giftedness in the kingdom is going to now be outside of lawyering and connected to construction? And so then I get to joke how I'm not even allowed to change a light bulb in my houses because of my construction talents, and yet I am supposed to think I'm going to go build orphanages. I just think that we have to, on a macro level, understand that disconnecting ourselves from the thing that we did throughout our career, where we have the most experience, the most expertise, the most wisdom, that it's a big burden for me to believe that that is the domain someone should not be connected to in more senior years of their life. Now, maybe they're mentoring, maybe it's much less of a time commitment. There's more freedom around it. I'm not trying to be legalistic here, but it is a framework or a mentality that I want to challenge people on. If I'm starting at the more uncharitable side of this, many that we would call elderly have sort of asked for that marginalization by leaning into this. A lot of people are familiar with John Piper's famous message about not wasting your life. And he used an example from a Reader's Digest of a couple that just sold their medical practice or dental practice, whatever they had done, and gotten an RV and were just going to go around the country collecting seashells. And he yelled at the group he was speaking to, don't waste your life. And that became a subject of a book and a theme from the ministry of John Piper. And there's something to that a lot of the baby boomer generation, you look at these retirement communities that are basically, a fraternity scene for 70-year-olds, bars everywhere you look, and the golf courses and everything. And there's an entitlement of, I've earned it, I work so hard. And so all at once, I want to honor seniors who have produced goods and services that met the needs of humanity and done so a great sacrifice in industry for 30, 40 years. I acknowledge their right to reap the fruits of that labor. But I think that what you do is you end up marginalizing their usefulness when you treat them as now they are just merely out to play.
Yeah.
And then on the other side of this, where it's not boomers that are begging to go star in a new golf club commercial with their lives, forced retirement age, I think, is absurd. Companies that are pushing their folks out the door. Now, let's make the caveat that there are changes in what one's mental and physical capabilities, acuity may be. There are, in certain cases, technology or marketing or different fields that you certainly want younger perspectives as well. There is a benefit to and a division of labor that speaks to the giftedness across different age groups and different energies and dimensions in the marketplace. I get all that. But just simply saying to our seniors, you have nothing left to contribute, please go away. Yeah, and you're asking 29-year-olds to run the world. I think it's insane. And I think the victims of it have been the seniors, and it's been all of us who have lost their expertise and experience in the marketplace.
You've been listening to The Virtuous Mind, a podcast from Providence Christian College. The mission of Providence Christian College as a reformed Christian institution is to equip students to be firmly grounded in biblical truth, thoroughly educated in the liberal arts, and fully engaged in their church, their community, and the world for the glory of God and for service to humanity. We'd love to have you visit our campus. Providence Christian College is now accepting applications for the upcoming semester. Contact an admissions counselor to learn more. Visit providencecc.edu.